Androvna Ulyanovna's in her family's revolutionary struggle, which was published in Women's History Review. Her article, Children of the Revolution, Parents, Children, and the Revolutionary Struggle in Late Imperial Russia, was published in Journal of the History of Childhood and Youth. Tonight, Katy's going to speak to us about women in revolt, the female experience of the 1917 revolution. Over to you.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks, first of all, to Simon and to Brendan for inviting me to speak today, and thanks to Liz for chairing. It's such a delight to be able to speak about women in the revolution on the 23rd of February, which is traditionally the start of the February Revolution, which was started by women. So it's really a perfect storm, besides Doris, that you all battled through to get here tonight. And since I'm talking about women in the Russian Revolution, I thought I would start with a man. A completely familiar face to all of you, I'm sure, one of the leading figures of 1917. And I want to read out his description of his experiences of the February Revolution in particular. Can I just check, can everyone hear me okay at the back? Yeah. Okay, so what does he have to say? In those first days of the revolution, the Duma became the symbol of the state and the nation. By a determined, united effort, a new authority and the rudiments of a new national structure were set up. I saw new forms of government shaped by men, who the day before would have turned in horror from what they did that day with their own hands. They did it because something inexplicable, mysterious, miraculous had happened, that which we are accustomed to call revolution. This something lit up the souls of men with a purifying fire and filled them with love and readiness for boundless self-sacrifice. We forgot everything that was merely personal, all that was a matter of class or caste, and became for the moment simply men, conscious of our common humanity. It was a moment when every man came into touch with what is universal and eternally human. It was most exhilarating to see about me these men, so transformed, working together with sublime devotion for the common good. What's really striking about this description, as will not have escaped your notice, is that the revolution is entirely masculine in Kerensky's view. It's universal and eternally human, but women are not a part of it. It's men who are lit by this purifying fire. They're the ones ready to sacrifice themselves. It's men who find their common humanity and touch the divine, no less, with this miraculous event. And women are not part of it at all. In fact, they're implicitly rejected by the reference to forgetting the personal, if we accept that that's where women are to be found, in the private, the domestic, the emotional. And in some ways, our understanding of the revolutions of 1917 haven't really moved all that far from Kerensky's perspective. There are four key moments where women feature in the narrative of that miraculous year, that revolutionary year. Obviously and inevitably we have the Tsarina, the cause of the Tsar's downfall, her hysterical belief in Rasputin, her ignorant conservatism, her mother's love trumping all political logic, symbol of all that's rotten at the heart of the Romanov dynasty. We have the March of Women on International Women's Day sparking the February Revolution, their desperation for bread, showing just how Russia had been pushed into desperation by the war. And obviously their appearance on the street seems to symbolise that great inversion that you always get with revolutions, tsars reduced to beggars, women acting as men, and so on. We've got women cropping up again in the defence of the Winter Palace in October, the weak provisional government defended by even weaker and hysterical female soldiers, the emasculation of the provisional government demonstrated by its being defended by women. And lastly, we've got the emergence of Alexandra Kollontai, the first female government minister in history, overseeing the liberation of women, and her act symbolising all that was idealistic about the Bolshevik programme. Revolutions and symbols go together. Revolutions and symbolic moments go together as well, and women make great symbols. Women are other and separate, and therefore they can be imbued with values. They can be reviled or revered, seen as exceptionally bad or exceptionally good. the language of gender, of male and female, imbues revolutionary rhetoric. It imbues rhetoric about statehood, national identity. And of course, we've also got to contend with that assumption that all women are the same, defined by their biological destiny, and therefore when you have these individual women popping up in the history books, then they can, of course, represent all women as well. And once these symbols have been dealt with, historians can get on with telling the larger story about the revolution itself, about the male leaders making vital decisions, influencing key events. And because this story is universal, as Kerensky would have it, there's no further need to talk about women. Except that's not a very convincing story anymore, as women's historians for the last few decades will have told us. Women didn't begin the revolution on the 23rd of February only to go home and knit socks while their menfolk take up the baton. The Tsarina and the women's battalion certainly become the focal point of discontent and rumour, but their place and role in the events of 1917 are much more complicated than these snippet moments that we see of them. And lastly, Kollontai and her agenda for the emancipation of women doesn't simply appear on the 25th of October 1917. The campaign for women's emancipation had a much longer history and was much more diverse than Alexandra Kollontai's interesting but individual life can ever encompass. So, what I thought I would do, rather ambitiously, is take you through the whole year of 1917 to try and get to grips with women's continual presence in that extraordinary year, their persistent engagement with the big questions that 1917 posed, and give a sense of more than their symbolic place in the revolution, their real, actual lived experience. Now, because I'm going to try very hard to be disciplined, I will not be able to go month by month, but I'm going to give you some edited highlights of non-symbolic but important moments I think that need to be flagged up. One of the funny things about the accounts of 1917 you always find is that January gets sort of hopped over and we start, 1917 starts on the 23rd of February often. But actually in January, there is actually a couple of important moments that I want to flag up. One of the first things which doesn't always get mentioned is that, as had been done every year since Bloody Sunday in 1905, the first Russian Revolution, there were marches to commemorate that event, the cutting down of peaceful protesters by government troops in that revolutionary year. And just as women had played a role in 1905, and that's a whole other talk, so too were they out on the streets to commemorate that event. It's also always worth taking a look at what the Okhrana, the secret police, are saying about what's happening, because their reports, above all, are aimed at trying to get to the truth of what's happening on the streets. And so they've learned by long experience that you can't not talk about what women are up to, from women terrorists to women revolutionaries and to women on the street as well. And their report from one of the reports from January 1917 is actually quite striking. Mothers of families exhausted from the endless queues at the shops, suffering at the sight of their sick and half-famished children, at this moment are much closer, indeed, to revolution than are Misters Milyukov, Rodichev and co. from the Cadet Party, the Liberal Cadet Party. And of course they are more dangerous because they constitute a mass of inflammable material for which only a spark is sufficient to cause it to burst into flames. So I like the fact that the Okhrana are on to the fact that women are a force to be reckoned with. They have obviously specific discontents, but discontents that are shared by other men in Petrograd and beyond. And they're aware of their revolutionary potential. And of course, they weren't wrong, because on the 23rd of February, International Women's Day, a strike, a demonstration was launched by women in the capital in Petrograd. Now, historians still have a tendency to call it a spontaneous event, and certainly there were spontaneous elements, women rushing off to get men to come out and join them and so on, but the march of the 23rd of February had been planned in advance. I think that's always important to recognise. In fact, women workers in the trolley car park at Vasilevsky Island were so on the ball that before the 23rd of February they'd hopped off to the local regiment to check if they would be firing on the crowds on the 23rd. And when they got a negative response, no we will not, then they were prepared to join the demonstration. And photographs speak volumes about women's being out on the street. Here's calls to increase rations to the families of soldiers, feed the children of the defenders of the motherland. Now, as I said, the history books tend to sort of stop talking about women on the 23rd, but they play another very important role in those events, and that is reaching out to the soldiers and trying to get the soldiers not to fire on the crowds. And obviously one of the other fundamental moments of the February Revolution is the moment when the soldiers go over to the people. And you can see here women beseeching the soldiers, you can see their outstretched arms, and the banner reads 8-hour working day. Quite often women's slogans are reduced to bread. They're actually engaged with much bigger issues, including women worker rights. Okay. As I say, February the 23rd is usually the high point of women's place in the history books, but actually the following month is as important, if not more so, for women's involvement in the revolution. Now I'm going to go back to Kerensky for a moment. He's very proud of the fact that one of the first telegrams that he sends off as Minister of Justice is ordering the release of Catherine Breshkovskaya, the grandmother of the Russian Revolution, ordering her release from exile and her being brought to Petrograd with full honours. Now here's a classic moment of trying to play on the symbolism. Obviously, if Breshkovskaya has been released, if she's back in the capital, this symbolises everything that's great about the revolution. But of course she had been an activist for decades, she'd survived Siberian exile, and as you might expect, she comes back as an activist, and she's going to crop up again in my talk. Now we all know about the 23rd of February International Women's Day March, but in fact there was another one on the 8th, International Women's Day again, because of the two calendar systems. So women were out on the streets again on the 8th of March in huge numbers, again marking International Women's Day. And then they were out on the streets again on the 19th of March because the provisional government had, of course, issued a number of huge reformist proclamations, including universal suffrage. But the women who'd been campaigning for women's suffrage knew that universal didn't tend to include women, and there'd been no specific reference to it in the provisional government's announcement. So, on the 19th of March, the women's suffrage campaigners were back out on the street, 40,000 of them, demanding a meeting with Chikadze and Rodzianko to get concrete guarantees that women would be enfranchised as well. Chikadze hilariously claimed he had lost his voice and had a sore throat and couldn't come to see the women, and Rodzianko immediately passed the buck and got them to go off and see Prince Lvov as premier of the provisional government. But Lvov, in fact, held true to the promise of women's emancipation and said that women would be granted female suffrage. And this is one of these classic examples where we have to be aware when we're talking about women of the uneven progress of revolution by gender. So men's advance of progress in a revolution can often be at a much faster speed than it can be for women. And we've just got to watch that when we talk about universal rights, that we remember to see how women are faring. One last thing in March as well, the Bolsheviks get going, they revive Rabotnitsa. There's a march for women's suffrage. There we go. Yes, the Bolsheviks, the editorial board of Rabotnitsa got back together again. They revived the publication targeted at Russian working women and managed to get a circulation of up to 50,000 in 1917. I'm going to carry on to April, and then I'm going to begin to give you slightly less month-by-month analysis. But I wanted to flag up as well. Yes, another important event in April. Lots of accounts of Petrograd tend to be Russo-centric, when obviously Russia's empire was far more diverse than ethnic Russians. And this was a surprise to me as I started researching this talk. in April we had the first All-Russia Congress of Muslim women. And I think it's important to recognise that the revolution was an opportunity grasped by women across the Russian Empire. And at this Congress they spoke about equality between men and women, the abolition of the bride price, women's right to divorce, and other social problems. We've also got soldiers' wives mobilising to go to the Soviet to ask for better care to be taken of them, an improvement in their allowance, which the Tsarist government had first set up. They go to the Soviet asking for 20 rubles a month to see them through the hardship of their husbands being at the front. Dan, as the leading Menshevik, in fact, refuses this request, and Alexandra Kollontai steps up to defend the women's needs and to try and make arrangements for them.
Sorry.
But I think it's also important to recognise that women were involved, if you like, in the big political events as well. So April sees the first crisis for the provisional government, the formation of the coalition between the provisional government and the Soviet. And there are huge demonstrations either in favour of the provisional government, in favour of the Soviet. It's very easy in the sources to assume these were male-only affairs, but women also took part in these demonstrations. They too wanted to see the best form of government for Russia to resolve their needs. And it's important to see women working with men on, if you like, the big issues. Okay. May sees an important moment as well. This is the moment where the provisional government grants Maria Bochkarova the right to establish women-only battalions to see actual combat at the front. Obviously the war continues to be a huge problem for Russia at this point, and Bochkarova wants to see women join the campaign to try and win the war for Russia. It's important, I think, to include that here, not only for the boundaries that she breaks in terms of getting women into combat, but also to highlight the way in which women are diverse in their responses to 1917. There are socialist women, there are liberal women, there are women who are in favour of the war effort, women opposed to it, and it's always important to try and recognise the full spectrum of women's participation. Funnily enough, this is a big enough event, in fact, to attract the attention of Lloyd George and Emmeline Pankhurst, who comes to visit to review the women troops and to try and bolster the pro-war sentiment in Russia. Again, thinking about the diversity of women's experiences, Sophia Panina is someone that we should all be recognising as having a big role in 1917 as well. In some ways, she starts on the path that Kollontai finishes, in the sense that she joins the provisional government in a ministerial post, well, a deputy ministerial post. First in public welfare and then in education. She's a member of the Cadet Party on their central committee. She's a sort of a rallying point, in fact, for the cadet opposition to the Bolsheviks, which I'll come back to in a moment. Okay, I'm conscious of time wearing on, so let's move on to October then. In some ways, women disappear even more from the October accounts of October than they do from the February Revolution. But again, they had a place. Alexandra Kollontai is at the Bolshevik meeting that decides on the seizure of power. And women also participate both in the Bolshevik uprising and also in the defence of the provisional government. This is one of the moments, though, where we have to recognise that women were not in a leadership role, and we might want to try and tease out reasons why, although there are prominent figures, they cannot really be classed as leading figures in October. And so the main roles that we see women playing in the Bolshevik side in October is logistical. It's feeding the men, overseeing communications, offering medical support. Though Stites does argue that, in fact, there were more armed women in the uprising, the Bolshevik uprising, than there were defending the Winter Palace. Sophia Panina crops up. You'll all know, obviously, that the battleship Aurora was deployed by the Bolsheviks to threaten the Winter Palace as part of the Bolshevik seizure of power. Panina, which I didn't realise, was part of a 3-person delegation that went off to the battleship to try and stop them from firing. Unsuccessful, but you can see how in 1917 people were beginning to get used to the idea that women could actually be talking to soldiers and representing their government. And we also have to deal with the defence of the Winter Palace. It was in fact a mixed group of men and women soldiers that defended the Winter Palace against the Bolshevik uprising. The women soldiers tend to be accused of being hysterical. Hysterical is such a problematic word in history, always a weapon really used against women, and in almost every scenario that you see it, it tells you far more about the person saying it than actually the conduct of the person being accused of it. Certainly, though, the women were subjected to abuse, beating, and there were 3 rapes that are documented as well in the aftermath of the defence of the provisional government. So it was obviously a fraught experience. Of course, the last thing that we always mention about October, of course, is Colin Tighe's emergence as the first proper full minister in a government as the Commissar of Public Welfare. But again, in some ways, what's even more interesting beyond October is November, the following month, because this is the month that voting begins. The Bolsheviks maintain initially their commitment to the Constituent Assembly, and Russia goes to the polls. And again, what we can see are women participating wholeheartedly. Women candidates are put on the ballot papers. And in terms of turnout, 77% of men turn out, 70% of women turn out to vote. And again, this is a big moment where we can see women properly engaging in an active way with the political opportunities and rights that they're being afforded. But again, we can't escape the results. So 10 out of the 767 deputies elected to the Constituent Assembly were women. So we still sometimes find ourselves coming up against that wall where no matter the voting participation, in terms of the actual candidates being elected, women are still at a disadvantage. Okay. So let me draw some conclusions, point to some of the directions we might want to tease out further and discuss. Hopefully what I've indicated is that women were engaged with 1917. They took the opportunities, the freedoms that were granted to them by the provisional government and then by the Bolshevik regime, and had things to say about the revolution. And both on the common issues, if you like, the gender-neutral issues of the war, of what sort of government would be best for Russia. And then, of course, there were also, on top of that, specific issues which affected women particularly, which exercised them. They had to keep tabs on the government to push for voting rights, to push for better education rights, to get access to employment on an equal footing with men. We have to acknowledge that they weren't leaders. We have a few prominent individuals, but that doesn't mean that they weren't present, and I think that we don't necessarily give them the due recognition of the space they occupied in 1917. You know, they were visible on the street. They took up provisional government discussion time. They were on the political agenda, and were part of the common culture as well. You only have to look at the steps taken to obstruct women in 1917 to understand that they were obviously encroaching into new territory. And tied to that, we've got to watch out for this word backward. Quite often when you read about Russian women, you get told about liberals and socialists' assumption that Russian women were illiterate and backward, conservative, and sort of in hearty need of consciousness raising. But if you look at the struggles that women have in terms of trying to achieve their rights, participate in the constituent assemblies, then backwardness is something that can be seen in both sexes, and we maybe need to sort of de-gender that term. And my last point, as I wrap up quickly, nothing of what I have said is new. It has been documented for, well, decades now. There is a blooming, vibrant women's history of 1917. What we haven't managed to do yet as women's historians is get into the grand narrative, to change the discourse of the gateway texts, which still stick with their symbolic moments. And that is one of the big questions that women's historians now have to grapple with, is how we get this story of 1917 integrated properly into the grand narrative.
Thank you.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, I was going to say there are seats. If anybody needs to get a seat, there are spare seats. Okay, well, it's a lot of very, very interesting material there. And so we have some time, quite a bit of time for questions. Give people a moment, let's see, to think about their questions, okay, and for other people to get seated.
Obviously, when you think about leading Bolshevik women, you immediately go to Kollontai, you might think of Vanessa Armand, but there aren't loads and loads of names that you would immediately, or I would immediately think of. In 1917 itself wasn't just a revolution in Russia, there were revolutions and uprisings in other parts of Europe as well. I just wondered, are there instances of the women's movement in Russia or leading Bolsheviks being in touch with other movements elsewhere? I think obviously we know Clara Zetkin and there are lots of German socialist women. Were there more German socialist women who were leading at that time than in Russia? The Russian women's movement, was that connected with the rest of Europe? I just wanted a kind of international context on that.
Do you want to take a few at a time? I think that's the way we'll do it. Okay, so thanks very much. Yes.
Yes, so near the beginning you gave us that fascinating quote by the Okrana, fearing that women's anger would erupt into some unpredictable, uncontrollable revolution as they understood it. But then in the way you told the story, nothing like that happens. What does happen is that they do something more dangerous, namely to persuade the Tsarist troops not to fire. So I'm wondering, in what sense was that strategically planned, organized, or almost happened by itself, or did people try to prevent it, and so on? And how do you regard that juxtaposition between the Okrana's fears and what women really did?
One more to take here. Go ahead. Yeah.
Dr. Turton, thank you for the enlightening and interesting speech you gave us. It's very interesting you mentioned Alexandra Kollontai, because she's one of the most unsung heroes of the workers' movement as well as the Russian Revolution. But she became emancipated and politically conscious, so perhaps rather late, so mid to late 20s. And she sacrificed her marriage to go and study, and slowly, as she became more conscious, as she embraced communism, she realized from the outset that the women could only be free and liberalized by the creation of the communist society. Because she defined that women are exploited, demeaned, subjugated as a result of class, not gender, during feudalism and during capitalism. And she was always very thoughtful in how she approached the position. That's why when she decided to join the Russian Social Democratic Party, then subsequently the split in 1903, she did not rush to join either the Mensheviks or the Bolsheviks. But eventually, the more she embraced communism, she joined the Bolshevik Party just after the First World War. But one of the most important contributions of Alexandra Kollontai is after the Russian Revolution, she argued more for the women's rights, because she believed that's the only way you could achieve it, not under capitalism. And she was an opponent of Brezhnev-Tosk, and that was quite very important at the time in 1918. And also around that time, and following through 2 years later in 1920, the second Congress of the Comintern, she was very much the beginning of a movement known as the Left Communist Movement.
Can I just interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just finish now. I'll just
Question?
finish. Yeah, I just sorry. I'll just finish. And basically, that Russian Left Communist Movement gave rise to the Italian Left Communist Movement after the Italian Communist Party was formed in 1921. And we have a tradition now where left communism still exists, even up to now. And that's all started going back there. I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, thanks. We'll take one more question then, okay?
Yeah, the question was, moving into more of the social history, which is rather than famous people. The Bolsheviks had a women's section, there's a Genot there, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And what were they up to on the ground? What was their daily, what impact did they have? What did they do either before, during and after the October, whatever you call it, revolution maybe? What did they do? I mean, what was their daily role? Did they agitate? What sort of demands did they raise for women? How did they encourage them? What was their political lead given to women as part of the women's section of the Bolshevik Party?
Thanks very much. There's a lot there.
Terrific question. Yes, there were international links, and I think one of the things that's always important to recognise is the international links, not only just between the socialist women, but also between the feminist groups in Russia as well. There's a huge upsurge of women's emancipation movements around the world at this time, and we tend to sort of forget about the more liberal feminist groups that are working there together. In terms of emerging leading figures, there is a sort of similar imbalance in wider movements, and we always find ourselves in that really difficult analytical zone where gender is concerned, where it's very easy to universalise women's experiences on the basis of their gender, while also still trying to maintain the context of their specific environment. So we have that kind of difficult situation where the same kind of issues holding women back as theorists, including women's own reluctance to come forward. It's something we've still never quite grappled with enough, as well as sort of the response of the wider groups around them, which is a sort of a universal experiences versus the domestic context. I don't know how we square the circle with the Ukraina. Because on the one, there's still a huge body of works on February that want to see it as spontaneous, that want to see it as based on the kind of the emotional side of things, the horror of seeing the starving children and women's spontaneity and their fearlessness and ability to do more than men could somehow because they were women, versus the very organised element who were making their signs conscientiously and checking with the infantry. They probably, they were not expecting to have a revolution on International Women's Day. But then on the other hand, everyone was expecting a revolution by that point. So we've got that difficulty of when everyone's expecting a revolution, does the first sign of something revolutionary then just get called a revolution, and then everyone behaves as if it is a revolution, and that's what creates it? It's one of those ones I just don't know the answer to.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, yes. You do wonder how much that plays into it. Everyone seems poised, ready to be told, "This is the moment, guys. Let's go." Kollontai, yeah. She's phenomenally interesting, and she doesn't fit any neat pigeonhole either. She's as much concerned with women's emancipation specifically as with the wider socialist movement, and we do her a disservice to only deal with her as a feminist or only deal with her as a socialist. You're right, we've got to see that whole picture. And the women's section. Well, the Zhenotdel officially emerges after October, and you've got to give credit to the Bolsheviks that they put their money where their mouth is. Where the liberals prevaricate in February, Lenin himself, Trotsky, they are committed to women's emancipation, and so we see this raft of reform for women straight out of the gate. Having said that, they're not ever comfortable with women acting separately to target women, because of that old difficulty that if women are more loyal to their gender, then they can't be fully committed to their class. So we sort of end up in this zone, particularly after the October Revolution, where the Zhenotdel, it's all about consciousness raising to sort of ready them for the wider revolution. So finding sort of, the most progressive women in shop floors, giving them training, and then hoping that they will then raise the consciousness of women in the workshop. Before the revolution, there's nothing so formalised as a Genitdel in the Bolshevik party, but there's enough recognition that something has to be done to reach women, otherwise those terrible liberal feminists are going to hoover them all up. So people like Krupskaya, Armand, they're going out on the ground into shop floors, organising women and bringing them over to the cause. So, but it's always got to be done in a way that doesn't antagonise the party as a whole. Can't ever be seen as too feminist.
Thanks, Kate. Okay. More questions? Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about your interpretation of Bashkirova's involvement. I mean, there is a theory that the battalion was only allowed to exist in order to shame the men into action. So it's a very instrumental use of women in the war, as is often the case, as potentially was in the Second World War as well. I just wanted to hear a bit more about your view.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and I think you're.
Katy, do you want to?
Oh, sorry. Yes,
no,
sorry, I'm on a roll now. No. So no time, but yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I suppose I came here tonight wanting to hear a little bit more of maybe anthropology than history of women's lives and lived experience, and how this was operating in these February months and days, in terms of what was going on in these bread queues that the Ukraina were observing so much. How were they linking maybe different generations of women in the bread queues to the, 47% of the working class were women in the factories, in these textile factories and so on at that stage of the war? Isn't there more, has anybody done more anthropological studies of just how are women's lives working, and what was it that was contributing to this extraordinary level of activity, both planned and spontaneous? I don't quite get where we have this oppositional stance between the two. There obviously is both aspects. Can we say more about that?
Thanks very much. One more? Yep.
I was wondering how many of the women who were involved in the revolution were employed in workplaces, and how many were just housewives, and how much consciousness there was on the question of reproductive labor. I know the Bolsheviks talked about the double burden, but it was never really fleshed out. And furthermore, those that were not employed, formally employed, how did they organize all these actions? Where did they meet?
Okay, Bochkaryova and the Women's Battalion. Yes, you're absolutely right. There's definitely a sense that they can be used in that way to shame men to hold their nerve and stiffen their backbones and carry on fighting in the war. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of soldiers are so hostile to them, because they're at the end of their tether, and these women are arriving all keen to fight. I suppose for people who've looked into it more deeply, obviously they would be looking for the diversity of motivation, so that women join it for all sorts of different reasons, from the most patriotic, from the desire for their own fulfillment, and not necessarily, and out of a sense of comradeship as well. You have, before the women's battalions, you've got plenty of examples of women smuggling themselves and disguising themselves, and simply just wanting to fight, alongside their men. They feel that they have just as much of a duty to fight as the men, and it's not an antagonistic feeling. But as so often is the case, women get symbolic value rather than actual acknowledgement. Anthropological. There are studies looking at the bread riot, which obviously is one of the, and then obviously if you sort of follow that, into sort of the Babi Buntias or the anti-collectivization riots as well. So there are. Oh yes, a big one. Women's riots in opposition to collectivization, and often in the face of dekulakization. Women are the ones who are up in arms trying to stop the soldiers, and they were sort of a real force to be reckoned with for a while in the early 30s.
I was thinking about the forms. What's going on the ground that's creating this extraordinary action
in some ways, the Ukraina are actually remarkably sensitive to the real significance of what's happening. That one of the things they constantly come back to is that if you're standing for long hours on the streets and talking to each other, it's what you see over the war is a gradual breaking down of fear. You know, people don't worry so much about being overheard. There's much more potential to whip up the crowd. There's much more potential for anger to spread down a line, and for action to be taken. And as I say, the Ukraine are right on the money. They spot that potential for breaking down all the norms of deference and highlight the power of rumour that the bread queue specifically generate. Mobilising women. Well, I mean, the first thing is that obviously there's a huge shift in the number of women working in industry as the war progresses. Petrograd in particular has a real upswing of women being employed. There's often difficulty in getting to women to raise their consciousness, to organise them, because they work phenomenally long hours and then have to go home and look after the children and do the housework, and so there's all these kinds of extra difficulties. But they were also remarkably successful at doing it. Something I didn't mention was the laundresses' strike in the summer of 1917, where thousands of laundresses, the most downtrodden, probably illiterate, hardest to reach women, were organised by the Bolsheviks to go out on the streets and actually win their strike for better terms and conditions. On the just housewives, partly, I mean, obviously, they're out in the world in the bread queues. I've kind of talked about that already. One of the other things, and one of the things my own research is particularly interested in, is the relationship between men and women. And I'll use the family as a bridge between women's experiences and men. So if you look at the socialist parties, all the men are married. They all work with their wives. Their wives know what's going on. They're participants, even if they're not official members or if they don't have voting rights in party conferences. And so similarly, as men are... as men's consciousness is raised in the factories, even if their wife is stuck at home with the 10 children, they talk to their wives, of course they do, and that's one way to raise their consciousness. So they can be reached, but we've got to look for these sort of domestic channels potentially. So.
Next. Okay.
I've got paper here.
Yeah, I was wondering if we could talk about the next few years a little bit.
Yeah.
So I think it's 1918 onwards you start to get the laws passed that provided for sort of formal legal equality for women. You get the equal marriage laws, the freedom of divorce laws. My favourite one that I read about recently was single mums who needed support payments from a dad, where they couldn't establish who the dad was. They would make every man that it might be contribute all of that.
Seems fair enough.
Yeah. We also know that they started to create social creches in canteens and to try and carry out educational work to wipe out prejudice among the peasantry and the working class. My question really is, how much success did they enjoy on that front? We know the revolution was strangled not many years into its life. How far did they get with that kind of work?
Yep.
Thanks very much. The question, yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask a sort of general question really about women workers in factories. But if you read books about workers' committees and so on in Russia, like Petrograd, for example, is to give a plug to one of the previous speakers at these meetings. It's obvious that you have a very high percentage of industrial workers are women. But at the same time, if you look at how workers actually got organised, the actual workers' committees and so on, almost entirely run by men. And obviously, you can put forward very sort of general reasons for that. You can say ingrained sexism, you can say unequal division of housework and stuff like that. But I wondered if you have any sort of more kind of detailed comments about why there was such an extreme lack of women in actual forms of workers' organisation.
Okay, one more.
I was just wondering, post-revolution, when and to what extent were women educated? Like, you spoke about the illiteracy and the low education, but I was just wondering, when do they actually receive the benefits of these emancipation?
Thanks.
I think, yes, if I deal with the women's organisation first, and then I can do the two post questions together. what you've these are difficult questions. What you find with the women's movement is, and it's something as I flagged up slightly earlier, is that one thing that we don't properly haven't quite got to grips with is women holding back themselves. Women not having the confidence to go ahead. I mean, even if you take somebody like Krupskaya, she's right at the heart of the Bolshevik Party, and yet she doesn't ever take on any big roles. She's often quite content to go off and do local work, rather than, she never pushes herself forward for big posts in government and so on. And I read a really fascinating account recently about the women's auxiliary, the women's wing of Gapon's organisation in 1905. Gapon, the organiser of the march on what turns out to be Bloody Sunday. And the woman organiser talks in a really interesting way about how they organised the women, because she realised women wanted to participate but couldn't find a way in. And one of the key problems was shyness, was a lack of confidence, the expectation that they'd be shouted down by the men around them. But the minute she set up separate meetings for them where they sat down and they talked about women's experiences, women were politically conscious and quite well aware of their situation and how it ought to be improved. But it's just that the difficulty they always found was finding a space for them. And she also even talks about the difficulty with the Tsarist bureaucracy as well, that even though Gapon's organisation had the go-ahead to organise, they had to kind of do the women's wing under the radar because of the lack of acceptance by the bureaucracy of the women's organisation. So, and we really can't get away from things like the domestic burden, those kinds of things as well. That they have a real impact. But I think women are far more conscious, even if they haven't necessarily found their way into specific organisations. So, the history of the Soviet Union after the revolution. I think on the education front, it's one of who's the question? What's the person who asked the question? Yes. On the education, I think it's one of the huge success stories of the Soviet Union, particularly where women are concerned. So the literacy campaign is really successful. And then in terms of kind of the broader laws, it's such a complicated picture. I mean, the issue of alimony, for example, a lot of women are the ones protesting to the government saying, well, this law is great, but actually all that's happening is our, terrible husbands are absconding and not taking responsibility for the children. The law on equal divorce was passed so that women could free themselves from miserable marriages, and all the men hop off. So women, it's that the good path to hell is paved with good intentions, and so the Bolsheviks find that in terms of the law, things are much more complicated in terms of emancipating women. But the other problem, of course, is that there is still a great deal of patriarchy, and you can talk about the trend whereby once the new elite has been established, they want to look like the elites they used to know, the bourgeois elites. They expect to have a wife at home. They expect the luxurious trappings of a domestic life. They're not remotely interested in their women having a life and being politically active. I mean, Stalin himself makes a call and has his wife's party credentials rescinded after she has their first child. So Lenin steps in to defend her. In fact, there's that kind of difficulty. There's the whole political expediency. Where are they going to put their funds into? Childcare and kitchens are wildly expensive, and they're busy doing other things. And the last thing, I think probably the hardest thing for us to get our heads around is that, and we're still seeing the ramifications of it today, emancipation imposed from above doesn't necessarily go all that well. And you see this, that's why we've got this backlash now in contemporary Russia, where emancipation, as in the double burden sort of solidified in the system, is seen as a Soviet, a part of the Soviet system that wasn't all that great, yes, sort of lots of different tussling factors that sort of undermine what started out as a wholly positive agenda.
Thank you. Okay, any more questions?
Yes.
I'd like to know a
little bit more about this picture you put of the old Congress, old Russian Congress for Muslims.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, there are Tatars, women, because it's in Kazan. So I don't know if you can tell us a bit about this picture, or if there's any other research that could tell us maybe a little bit about, I don't know, the role of other nationalities, other women from other nationalities in the revolution this year, or Muslims. I don't know if you have done any research that you can find out or so.
Thank you. Anybody else now?
I don't know whether you mentioned Larissa Reisner, who was in the front line during the Civil War in 1918, which was critical. And somebody mentioned Coventry, but there was no one comparable to Rosa Luxemburg in any of these women. And the other main question, it was the direction given to the Russian Revolution from February to October was entirely by men, and I think the chief person really was Leon Trotsky. Credit is given to Lenin as being the first in line, but I think that is wrong, and there was no woman who gave direction to the Russian Revolution.
Thanks. Anybody else? Oh, yeah, Mark.
Yeah.
And we'll take it.
I mean, leadership is a strange thing. Clearly, Lenin, Trotsky, others led many aspects of the Russian Revolution. But one of the things that seems to have happened quite a lot is say, on demonstrations in various periods, what would happen is the workers wanted the demonstration, wanted the protest, and they would sort of insist that their Menshevik, Bolshevik representatives went to the front of the demo and were the ones who, faced the Cossacks or whatever. Now, where is the leadership there? Who's leading who when you're being forced, perhaps against your will, to be the leader? I mean, in this happens in a different way. Later on, I'm sure you will know that Lenin and others wanted something like state capitalism. They didn't want to have workers taking over all the factories immediately because they thought it would lead to chaos. But in practice, in 1917, the workers do take over large numbers of factories. In a sense, the workers are leading far more radically than the Bolshevik leadership, and that certainly happens in the case of the women in February 1917, where you get the women coming out from the bread queues and from the factories on International Women's Day, and then throwing snowballs and stones at the factories where the male workers are working, saying, you're coming out with us today, and we're gonna have the revolution. So again, who's leading who there? And I just think that the great tragedy of the Russian Revolution is that sort of leadership from below didn't continue. I mean, why it didn't continue is a very complex story, but obviously probably the one biggest factor is just the fact that everyone is close to starvation, and starvation, it can make you very angry and upset, but it also weakens you and confuses, and it's a huge, yes, to say the least, a problem. So the politics in Russia, in the Russian Revolution, became looking to leaders or governments which were going to basically save you from starvation, rather than anything more radical. I mean, that's very crude, really.
Do you want to comment on the comments and answer the questions?
Yes. I have to say that the experience of non-Russian women is not my area of expertise, and this that was a rather late addition to my paper. I suppose one thing I can say is that this is another very tricky area, because on the one hand, for the Zenitdel, the emancipation of Muslim women in particular was one of their huge areas of campaign, the unveiling campaigns that they sparked off in the Asian republics. It was definitely part of the emancipation drive, and you can see obviously that there was sort of independent support from that from the women, the women they were targeting themselves. But then all sorts of other difficulties come into play. The belief that the nationality should have their own indigenous cultures respected, and then of course issues of control as well. And in some ways it became more convenient to support the existing system and have the male authorities in the area content and happy, and not disrupting their relationship with the male authorities by trying to emancipate the women under their in their societies. So. so it's really fantastic. It's really fascinating to see this moment of an attempt by the women themselves for emancipation, but it very quickly gets swamped in sort of wider tussles for the establishment of the Soviet regime.
And the picture.
This was something I found. This was something I found, as I say, quite latterly. It was simply on a website. I can certainly, if you come and see me afterwards, I can tell you where I found it, because there's a scholar who's been obviously researching it and writing it, and this was her own web page. So I've lost it now. It's up there somewhere. Yeah, it's further up, isn't it? It's too slow. Have I gone past it? No, further up. There. The issue of leadership, well, that hasn't been resolved by any scholar yet on the revolution, and I have no desire to come to offer my own my own answers. I suppose on the women's leadership, the only thing is that they don't emerge as key figures, and we can't expect Russian women to have done anything more startling than women around the world, really. Having said that, what we have lost, I think, in our understanding is, the women had been pushing for reforms in Russia, and in some ways had made greater strides than their European sisters from the 1860s. And so, even if they didn't provide leadership, they had enough clout as an organised body in different forms to push the agenda, at least, and to make these male-only organisations and governments actually listen to their demands and try and meet some of them. So I guess we're back to leadership takes different forms, and the leadership from en masse can be as important, especially in a year like 1917, as an individual. Thanks for backing out of that one. Okay. Yes.
So I'd like to take you back to the point you made in answer to the person at the front about after the revolution, and I agree with you that there's these incredibly positive things, miles ahead of anywhere else in Europe, on abortion, on divorce. These legal changes really tremendous. And I also agree with you that there's a shortage of resources. There's a real drive by Kollontai and others, as far as I understand, to have the creches and so on. But I don't see that there's any, and maybe I'm wrong, and it'd be good to know your view. I don't see that beyond the idea of creches and kindergartens and the idea of collective canteens, which is a big deal, and which is actually used certainly in Moscow just in order to make sure people get fed as a kind of pragmatic measure in the face of shortages. But I don't see that beyond that there's any sense of what goes on in the home is labour, which would be a fundamental for socialist feminists now. I know we're 100 years on. And there's the row, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which I think is in late 22, 23. This is, nobody's really heard of Stalin at this stage except as a kind of secretary person. He's not a significant figure in the leadership. This is earlier than that. And there's the row about organising women, and somebody says, I think it's late 22 or early 23, somebody says, we have to get to the women who are being driven out of the workforce as a result of new economic policy and so on, who've been in the workforce during the war and the Civil War, and somebody else says, no, we're concerned about proletarian women. And proletarian women means women who've got a job. So that the organisation of women and the whole idea of the Zhenotdel and so on is focused on working women, and domestic labour and all the things that are going on in the home are a complete blind spot. I mean, for the party as a whole, really, and Clara Zetkin and other people are wheeled out to kind of, I can't remember the name of this woman who raises this, there's a big row takes place in the newspaper in Pravda, it's all very open, and Clara Zetkin and others are kind of wheeled out to hammer this person over the head and tell her that she's wrong. But perhaps you can give a more sophisticated and all-round picture.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the talk, really interesting. On a kind of similar theme, I was going to say, could you talk a bit more about this, the idea of the family in this period? Because on the one hand, there's a bit of fine talk about overcoming this bourgeois sexist institution. On the other hand, as you've alluded to, a lot of the political elites kind of fall back into this cultural norm, particularly in their personal lives. I'm sure it wasn't only the political elites, so if you could say a bit more about that.
Anybody else here?
Yeah, thank you for an interesting talk, and I guess my question also relates to the two previous ones. But as far as I've understood, Kollontai herself didn't really see herself as a feminist, because she didn't see feminism as her project, because feminism was a bourgeoisie project, and her emancipation, her idea was something different. And I just wondered if you could say something about it, because that also ties up to their cooperation with women's movements in other Western European countries at the time.
Yeah, I mean, on the housework, yes, it's like you say, it's a huge blind spot, as it still is today. I mean, there is a famous conversation between Clara Zetkin and Lenin, which that's published, where she talks to Lenin about it, in fact, and Lenin comes back saying, well, until we get all these creches and everything sorted out, men should just take over some of the housework, But you're right, it's not something that's ever addressed. I mean, it always crops up for International Women's Day, doesn't it? That's the one day in the year where, the Russian women get flowers from their menfolk and the men are supposed to take on the household duties. But for the rest, in this great celebration of women, but for the rest of the time, everything goes back to normal. No, it is not resolved. I mean, I think you're quite right. But it's far too easy not to resolve it, because, why would you spend oodles of state money on something that women are doing anyway, family life. Again, it's one of my big areas of interest is looking at the family life of revolutionaries, and one of the striking things about the underground movement, the pre-revolutionary movement, is that there's a great deal of traditional family life on the go. Trotsky talks about hard times he had once in exile, in European exile with his wife. He said, it's terrible times, we couldn't afford a nanny, so all the childcare burden fell on my wife, and then he went, so they don't see it, and you can't, this is 100 years ago, they don't see it, and so in some ways there's great continuity between the family life of the revolutionaries before the revolution and the family life that they have afterwards, and if these most conscious and sort of devoted to socialism individuals can't see the need for or how to transform family life, then we sort of can't expect it to sort of roll out across the rest of the country. I mean, I suppose the only other thing to say is that, when the state does start talking about creches and so on, there's also a huge amount of anxiety about it, because the policy is very misunderstood, and there's lots of fear about the common village bed where all the women are available for all the men because women are now emancipated sexually, and there's great fear that these national creches mean that the children will be taken away from their parents. So there's also a sort of resistance from the population as well, that they quite like family life, and they certainly don't like what seems to be these very drastic changes, which obviously it's a misunderstanding. But and then Kollontai on family life, on the emancipation of women. She's very interesting. I mean, we know her for abandoning her marriage and her child to go off and join the movement, but like lots of women who did leave a family home to go and join the movement, she was quite quickly reconciled with her son afterwards. These were never permanent breaks, so she spends a lot of time looking after her son, and they maintain a mother-son relationship. It's that difficulty where there is great crossover between the pure feminist agenda and the socialist agenda, where some of the questions are inevitably the same, and in some ways, because of that, she certainly goes beyond a lot of what socialist men around her are prepared to accept. As soon as she starts talking about sexual emancipation, this is just far too radical for them to cope with on any level. Even though a lot of them had been enjoying sexual emancipation themselves their entire lives. I mean, we always talk about Kollontai's love life. We never talk about Stalin's. But but certainly for her, the socialist government seemed to be the best possible way to achieve it, the best possible way to achieve women's emancipation, and to consider at least that, one of the things that triggers it above all for her is this awareness that, this notion of women confined to the domestic sphere and needing to be liberated from family life was only half the burden that worker women experienced. That she was well aware that the capitalist system compounded the double burden, long before there was recognition that this was probably a problem for women, and so for that reason, socialism ends up being her area.
Further questions?
Can you talk about the Soviet destruction of the capitalist institution that was like the nuclear family and marriage, and how that affected women in Russia at the time, and also the psychological state of children before, and girls and also.
Did you hear that?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
I want to ask what your general conclusions are from your studies about today, what the situation is today, because revolutions are made by classes, not by sexes, and from what you said, the women started the marches and the revolution on the Women's Day, and that was women from textile factories, as far as I know. But they brought out the men as well. And then the women tried to stop the soldiers from shooting on the men. The men ran away from the police, regrouped, attacked the police, and there were 1,300 people killed in the February Revolution. So it's not just women; it's women and men. It's a class fighting another class. Today we've got something like over 50% of the working class in Britain is women. Do you have any general conclusions for today? What does your studies tell you?
Okay, that's a biggie. Right. Anybody else before Katy tackles those? Yeah.
So, I was sort of fumbling in that area in my own head. The standing on the shoulders of giants, isn't it? Nowadays, if it wasn't for the Russian Revolution and all the things that happen now, if you look around the world, trying to accept unfortunate examples like Theresa May, the number of women leaders in every walk of life, and especially in socialist circles, is enormous. And if we look at the Americans, the Black Lives Matter and the Fight for 15 and so on, not to mention, of course, the huge demonstration after the election, women are right there in the forefront.
Anybody else before let's get somebody who hasn't spoken. Okay, sure. Okay, do you want to respond?
I'm glad you raised children, because I am also interested in the place of children in the revolutionary movement, and there are, they are, unfortunately, sort of political footballs in some ways, in the sense that that lots of policies about them, but obviously no ability themselves to react or defend themselves and so on. And certainly there's lots of accounts of people remembering their childhood being the children of revolutionaries in the underground, and sort of all sorts of hardships that they endured, sort of being dragged around town by their mum, going on different errands and so on, learning to be silent, ones who'd gone into prison being, psychologically damaged. You also get the flip side. So Vera Broido, the daughter of Mark and Eva Broido, Menshevik leaders, talks about how much she enjoyed being in Siberian exile with her mother, because it meant she was with her all the time. So, and then certainly, after the revolution, we do have these problems where there are, there's lots of instability in family lives, obviously caused by events themselves, the Civil War and all the traumas associated with that, and the other traumas of the 20s and 30s, too numerous to mention here. and there's sort of varying perspectives on the place of children as well. I mean, as you know, there's a fairly quick retreat from the notion that, you know, children should be turning on their politically unreliable parents and so on. But by the time you get to the 1930s, children are back to talking about how traumatic it was to, you know, knowing how to be silent, you know, and knowing that they couldn't speak out of turn and that they had to be careful what they said to whom because of the sort of the atmosphere that they lived in. And then, of course, in the terror, children are targeted, children of old Bolsheviks and the other targets in that. So, yes, no easy time for the children. And I haven't even mentioned all the orphaned children out of the Civil War who are, you know, not cared for well by the state and eventually swept up in the purges themselves. So how are we going to have this revolution then? That was the last question. You know, I'll just head out from now. I think, I mean, like so many studies show that if you actually pay attention to women's lot in society, if you start improving their lot, then everyone benefits. So if women are properly involved in the workplace, if women are educated, economies are much better. You know, aid projects work better if you think about women's needs. Society grows if women are educated. You know, if you think about reproductive rights, you know, it improves things like child mortality. So, you know, I'd be quite content to see a revolution entirely spurred by looking after, you know, sorting the world out for half the population, you know. And the thing is, you guys would benefit as well, you know. So maybe that's where we've been going wrong all these years. But the other thing that's clear is that the genders have to work together in peace and harmony as well. You know, that the reforms were best made when the women campaigners had leading figures, leading male politicians who were on their side, who agreed with their agenda. You know, for all their flaws, Lenin and Trotsky at least both wrote about the emancipation of women, even if they couldn't live it themselves. Stalin did not believe in women's emancipation. So, you know, you have to have agreement between the sexes about how to improve the world if you know, we're going to do it. Oh, that's deep, wasn't it? I'll give finale. Let's stop there.
Take maybe some last questions. I think we're beginning to come to an end. Anybody who hasn't asked a question, because it'd be good if you have anything burning, because there's an awful lot of information, lots to think about here. Yeah.
What's happening in Russia right now with all this stuff? People are having talks like this.
It's so funny. Somebody okay. Any other last question? Suddenly lots of people.
It's an observation.
Oh, okay.
It's an observation, basically. Isn't this the problem with sectionalising aspects of things? I mean, slavery basically was done away with because it became really unprofitable. Really and truly, it wasn't just because it was wrong, it was becoming unprofitable. Capitalism has adapted these days to women being part of and leading parts of the system. So it's a natural problem for socialists, for communists, to talk about it in two separate ways, because yes, we would all hopefully say yes, emancipation is a good thing, it's what we want, but actually clever people can adapt that to capitalism and actually nothing changes, because beneath, for the next generation, there's still an underclass provided, be they black, from any of the, or women, people that are traditionally seen as being the people that you're trying to emancipate. The problem is class all the time, as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks. Lots of other hands went up back there. Yeah.
I was just going to ask about your source material. What are there any, to get sort of women's voices? Are there any particular types of sources that you go to or maybe?
Thanks. Was there one other person? Because then I think we're probably coming to.
Probably. Sources. Yes, class trumps everything. I don't know. I respect your. Yes. I don't know the answer to that. It's one of these big conundrums, but I can talk about sources though. So my particular favourite kind of sources are the memoirs. I like the family letters, I like memoirs. What I find particularly interesting is that, you know, if you read the theories about memoir literature, you know, they'll tell you, revolutionaries don't talk about their personal life, you know, men especially don't admit to anything, but I would suggest that it's not as clear cut as that, and actually you get some wonderful insights into the family life of revolutionaries, which is my interest, from these kinds of sources, you know, where they do talk about the dilemmas of leaving wife and child behind, or going out the door and not knowing if you'll be arrested on the street and not see them for 5 years, you know. So and similarly, I think women's memoirs are particularly good because they are certainly better at giving you a holistic picture of what the movement is like. So Krupskaya's memoirs are quoted by everyone, but I'm not sure that it's totally appreciated that she gives not only, you know, she gives a sort of social and slightly anthropological look at what it's like to be a revolutionary. She recognises the presence of women, of children, while also talking about the big political theories, and she sees the movement as a whole, where potentially other ones which focus only on the political miss a dimension, I would say, about how the movement actually worked. So.
Okay. I think that's probably quite a broad breadth of challenging material.
Yeah, that's it.
Are there any last words, Katy?
No, I've said plenty. Just thank you very much.
But can we thank Katy?